So now we are in the second part of today's program where Dr. Shambhu Ram Simkhada. Please turn on your video, sir. He is a diplomat for long-term career diplomat, and also he has been teaching in our conflict, peace, and development studies program and many other as a scholar and very well-known scholar in Nepal. And today, Dr. Shambhu Ram Simkhada has generously given his time from, he's in New York now in the morning time. And since Mahatma Gandhi also utilized a wisdom tradition from very many different sources in his life, and since he's a very well-known name, and I gave you about Gandhism in the last lecture, but from a diplomat, from a perspective, a student of IR himself, a scholar himself, he has to offer something from his worldview, from his reflective practices, and from his scholarly practices. So with this, please, sir, please unmute your phone, and I will take you from here. Thank you. Please unmute yourself. Yes.
All right.
Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
And perhaps visible?
Yes, both.
Okay. Very good.
And you look also very, very, very sharp.
Well, I have a little bit of jet lag because I've just arrived here 2 days ago. And of course, I'm in a different location. So you'll have to bear with me on those things. Well, first of all, Professor Sitaula, thank you for inviting me to present this lecture on Gandhi.
Sorry, sir, what happened? Can you please unmute yourself, sir?
Yeah, I have, but
yeah,
it
okay,
says
please go ahead. I'm so sorry.
the host unmuted me.
No, this is
Okay. Well, again, I'm delighted to be participating in this short conversation with your students in Masters in International Relations, second year, I believe. Well, first of all, good morning, and from the US, good afternoon there. Namaste and Om Santi. I don't know how many of you have known, in fact, that at the end of the last century, the 20th century, the Time magazine conducted a global survey of the most respected statesmen of the entire century. The Albert Einstein was regarded as the most respected person of all disciplines. But Mahatma Gandhi was identified by this global survey as the most respected political figure, statesman of the entire 20th century. And another well-known person, Martin Luther King, once remarked on Mahatma Gandhi that we may ignore Gandhi at our own cost, at our own risk. And when you look around the world today, especially from the perspective of international relations, both as a student and teacher of IR at different universities in Asia and Europe, as well as having seen the discipline from a practitioner's perspective, as you say, from the other side of the fence, I absolutely agree with the great Martin Luther King that, in fact, humankind has ignored Gandhi at our own peril. And so, what is his relevance in IR today? First of all, what do you understand by international relations? My own definition of IR is the state of great power relations and how they affect the rest of us. And if close to the epicenter today, the Ukraine war, is a reflection of the state of great power relations and how it is affecting not just the warring sides, but in fact the entire Europe and the world. So this shows that the two fundamentals of international relations, one is called power and the other one is interest. And those of you who have read this is, in fact, foreign policy is defined as the application of national power for the protection and promotion of national interest. So the events of going on around the world today, the 3 C's as the United Nations calls it: climate crisis, COVID, and conflicts. These 3 C's represent the failure of what I call the contemporary power interest paradigm. And why has that happened? Because the world has ignored Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi is too large in terms of his philosophy, and he is too important for any one lecture to cover all of his. So I have identified, sent you in my slide, in my PowerPoint, simply 5 areas which I believe are most fundamental in our understanding of international relations and what Gandhi's philosophy means. One is the notion of power and the need to redefine, re-understand, and reapply the concept of power. Second, his notion of Swaraj, Satyagraha, essentially a self-determination, and how it relates to the key element of what we study and teach in international relations called the notion of sovereignty. How the concept of sovereignty, around which all the behavior of nation states are focused, how that notion has transformed from the classical monarchic, papal, imperial to the post-Westphalian territorial sovereignty. And today, on the strength of technology, how that notion of sovereignty is further transforming or struggling to transfer into what some people call the individual sovereignty. Second. Third, you talked about the unsustainability of the world and its contemporary development paradigm. Gandhi talked so long ago about his Sarvodaya movement based on several factors on the utilization of local resources and needs, and a very relevant issue in contemporary economics called the voluntary control of unlimited human wants. Today, many of you may know that people have started saying that talking about sovereignty, the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, is in fact already irrelevant now. In fact, we need to talk about regenerative development model. So Gandhi already talked about that in his time. Fourth, human rights is a very fundamental issue of contemporary IR. Everybody talks about it. But Gandhi says, there is Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the fountainhead of all international discourse on human rights today. And yet, out of the 30 articles of the UDHR, only one is devoted to human duties. And to demonstrate how lopsided that is, Gandhi says human duties are fundamental in expecting human rights. And finally, our contemporary understanding of IR partly depends on this so-called East and West, further defined by North and South, sometimes developed and developing. These differences. But technology has transformed human society, the human enterprise, so much that technologically, or at least physically, here is a man from Nepal who was born in the hills of the mountains of Nepal, was born and raised in an environment where technology was absolutely absent, then went on to Kathmandu, went on to do his PhD to the United States, worked in the UN, in Europe. They're talking to you in Norway technologically, making it possible. And yet, when chairing some of the most important global conferences, something that came into my mind is the world needs to meet. Technology has transformed us as human family. And yet, do we see that behavior? And so Gandhi as the meeting point of all of these contradictions, East and West, North and South, developing, and so on. So I'll briefly talk about these 5 issues and conclude with a few of my own thoughts. So first of all, Gandhi and power. As I said, power, or understanding what do you mean by power, what makes you powerful, is very central in the study of international relations. Many of you must have read on the classical elements of national power. Then, of course, during his course of discussion, Professor Sitaula talked about hard power and soft power. Now, of course, there are all other definitions of smart power, hyperpower. In fact, during COVID, I wrote a piece called the viral power, how a tiny virus that you cannot even see with your eye turned the most powerful countries and people of the world so powerless. So the understanding of what do we mean by power and the contemporary crisis that we are talking about is in fact because of our wrong understanding of the notion of power and its application. Why? Because power and justice, the relationship between power and justice have in fact been the central dilemma of politics and economics, whether you talk of conventional wisdom, Plato, Aristotle, to modern day. You talked about, Professor Sitaula talked very extensively on Oriental wisdom, Gita and Confucianism and so on. So whether you talk about conventional wisdom or modern day thought, whether you talk about academic philosophy, wisdom, or action, political action, in fact, the relationship between power and justice is central. Politics, economics, security, as I told you, foreign policy is about maximizing power. But once you have that power, what do you use it for? All conventional thinking, all modern scholarship recognizes that if power is the central instrument of politics and economics, justice must be its goal. And when you disconnect between these two important dimensions of power, this is what you get. What you're getting today, the world. So Gandhi so rightly put it, in the race between man and power depends the future of civilization. So this rethinking of the notion of power, that in fact it is relative and it is also dynamic, that if you continue to apply the traditional distorted convention of power, that is why the rise and fall of the great powers. Paul Kennedy's famous book, Prof. Sitaula mentioned a little bit about the book on America's declining power. That is yet a question. Is that happening? But Paul Kennedy talks about why big powers rise and fall. And it's all centered around the understanding of the notion of power and how you use it. So, central to Gandhi's philosophy is this idea of rethinking power, that we need to rethink power, otherwise we are in difficulty. And here, when you talk about Oriental wisdom and Western political thinking, Western political thought, in fact, also security conceptualization on which diplomacy and international relations are based, is based on one simple notion of a Greek Latin notion called civis pacem para bellum. You prepare for war to maintain peace. Oriental wisdom talks about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, Sarve Bhavantu Sakinam, Sarve Santu Nirama. Let everyone be happy. And once you transform these traditional Western conceptualization of a suspicious nature of power, and as a result, the need to prepare for it. But when you prepare for it, ultimately it has its own dynamic that you use it. So as a result, there is a need to transform from the traditional mutually assured destruction conceptualization to a more win-win relationship. But that also will depend on our understanding that the humanity does not exist in its prehistoric or historic age. That in fact, technology has brought us together. What we need is a reorientation of our psychology, a reorientation of our culture. And Gandhi is central in that. Now, the second, Swaraj and Satyagraha. Gandhi's basic philosophy of Swaraj and Satyagraha was ultimately democracy depends on the acceptance of individual self-determination. And when that right is impringed upon it at any level, then the humanity, by virtue of being a freedom-seeking species, has not only the right, but in fact the duty to revolt, satyagraha. But that satyagraha must not be based on violence to others, the notion of ahimsa. And it's the same thing with power. In fact, when you talk about power, many of you may remember that when Gandhi started launching his campaign to liberate India from the yoke of colonialism, one of the well-known, perhaps one of the most well-known British prime ministers, first said, I don't want to sit together with this half-naked fakir, describing Gandhi, because Gandhi used to wear his dhoti, showing most parts of his body. but how he demonstrated that, in fact, ultimately that half-naked fakir, through his campaign of non-violence, ahimsa, was able to defeat the most powerful nation state of that time. So as a result, his notion of satyagraha and swaraj is a culmination of the evolving notion of sovereignty. You know, today there are many books on what you call individual sovereignty. Of course, the debate is going on as to the uh, authority of the nation state, and of course the relationship, the contract between the state and the people, the individual. There are people who are now saying that, in fact, technology has transformed the locus of power from the institution, the state being the most powerful and most highest form of institutionalization human mind has thought of so far. In Europe, of course, you are undergoing a process of transformation. That, in fact, the traditional notion of sovereignty is being pulled together, is being shared through different processes. But Ukraine war, I don't know if we can talk about it. I've been engaged in this discussion of how the Ukraine war are going to ultimately affect the so-called European project. Is it going to strengthen this idea of interstate relations based not on classical notion of force and power and violence, but more on norms and rule-based order that, in fact, the EU is moving towards? How is that going to be affected? But anyway, the point is partly, for instance, the European Court of Human Rights, in fact, subjugating all of the national courts into, the ultimate decision of the European Courts of Human Rights is partly a reflection of how this movement from the traditional territorial sovereignty, the geographic sovereignty of within the nation state boundaries, is trying to evolve itself into a more individual sovereignty. The cryptocurrency debate, what is it? It's essentially to liberate individuals from the clutches of the central bank, which is one of the most important instruments of state power, to individual ability to decide on his own how he wants to transact economically. So all of these are evolving technology that empower the individual to move beyond the traditional concepts of institutionalization. So today, the Cold War, and now the new talked about Cold War between US and China, is it really about the ideology? I don't have time to go into deeper reflections on deeper discussion on how, if you study deeper Adam Smith and Karl Marx, in fact, in many of these, they converge on the limited scope, economic scope of the state system as we have it today. And as a result, as technology transforms, the need to transform also geographically, building into a notion of global governance for a society, for a global society which transforms itself into technology across the borders. All of these are important discussions, but the important thing is how Gandhi conceptualized the classical notion of sovereignty into a more futuristic and modern sort of individual self-determination. The third issue is the issue of global sustainability. At the moment, you remember, many of you, if you have witnessed the UN summit of 2021, how a little girl, Greta Thunberg, went in front of the assembly of global leaders and challenged them, saying, "You have ruined my future." And of course, we had no, global leaders had no answer. At the moment, if the world is going in the current speed, we all know the consequences. Although there are some who try to deny the climate crisis as not being there, but all scientific real indicators are that the present rate of consumption is not sustainable. So Gandhi, in his notion of Sarvodaya or sustainable development, talked of what you call voluntary control of unlimited needs, unlimited wants. Human wants are unlimited. The difference between animal behavior and human behavior is, on one side, there's a famous Chanakya sloka, ahara nindra bhayamaithunani samani chaitani nrinam pasunam jnanam narana madhiko viseso jnane nahina pasuvi samana, which means this notion called jnana is only innate to human species. No other species have that inner conscience of right and wrong. And when human beings gets overtaken by carnal desire for physical consumption, physical pleasures, physical satiation of its unlimited wants, this is what happens. This is what happening. There's a tremendous study that I once came across, that if at the present rate of consumption, if even 20% of the population of the developing world were to consume the same amount of meat that Western countries consume, it will completely disbalance the global economy, global ecology, because that has its own dynamics. So he talked of Sarvodaya and sustainable development. Gandhi also talked about vegetarianism. Now, of course, you can discuss about it, you can talk about it, but the point is the current level of the current development paradigm has to change. Without it, there is problem of sustainability. Now, of course, the World Economic Forum, one of the foremost think tanks of the world, where most of the world's rich and famous come and talk about things. In fact, it has now come up with the idea that this sustainable development idea is in fact already become outdated. What we need to talk about is regenerative development paradigm. So Gandhi already talked about this notion through his movement, through his notion of Sarvodaya, which is based on local needs and resources and sustainability, controlling human wants, and of course, evolving consumption patterns that go with the sustainable nature of what nature has given us. That is why he said that the world has enough for human needs, but not human greeds. I was talking about the difference between animalistic behavior and human behavior. If on the one hand, we have this jnana, internal consciousness, chaitana, of right and wrong, but when overtaken by the desire for power and profit, the greed for power and profit, human being becomes blind to the extent that a lion will only kill another animal enough to feed itself. But there's absolutely no limit to human greed for power and profit. And that makes Gandhi's notion of Sarvodaya so relevant today. Human duties and human rights. 。 I don't know if Professor Sitaula has given my introduction, in the sense that I was chairing what is called the most central institution of global human rights. It's called the UN Human Rights Council. Many of you have heard about it. In the old days, when I was Nepal's ambassador to the UN, it was called UN Human Rights Commission. And I had the great honor to chair the Human Rights Commission. And when I looked up, heads of state, heads of government delegations, NGOs, individuals coming and speaking, everybody is talking about their own right. But you cannot talk about your rights without talking about your duty to respect the rights of others. How about that? And so most conflicts of today is because we are so obsessed with our rights, forgetting our duties. Duties to self, duties to society, and duty to the world, duty to Mother Nature. And so Gandhi is simple. Gandhi all his life worked for the rights of those who were rightless, the Dalits, the Muslims, the downtrodden. There were many followers of Gandhi. There was a mention of Mandela. Mandela was a devout follower of Gandhi. So when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was being drawn, the executive director of UNESCO invited Gandhi to give his thought. And you know what Gandhi wrote back? He says, I've learned from my illiterate but wise mother that all rights come from duty well done. So when everybody forgets about their duties, I mentioned to you about this Universal Declaration, that out of the 30 articles, there's only one on human duty. Very sort of connected sort of notion. So when I was sharing all of this, it became clear to me that unless we look back and realize that talking about our rights, we must talk also about our duty to respect the rights of others, not to infringe the rights of others. The human rights is only that is why I have in the reference material, after a long time debating whether I should publish it or not, I finally, there are many friends from both Europe, America, Asia, who urged me, saying that, look, it is only you can say this. So as a result, I have published a book called Human Rights, Human Wrongs in the Scale of Human Conscience. That in fact, this, without exercising human conscience of right and wrong, only talking about rights will only make the world as it is today. And finally, my 5 conceptualizations of what makes Gandhi so relevant today. Perhaps the most critical is this idea of Gandhi as the meeting point of both East and West, North and South, developed and developing. And Gandhi derived this on the basis of, there's a lot of talk about spiritualism, different religions, Gita, Quran, Bible, and so on in the session that preceded me. And when listening to all of those, Gandhi derived his inspiration from truth. The only one book, My Experiment with Truth, that was his idea. And all of the characteristics that were described in the various scriptures. So Gandhi was an amalgamation of not one religion, not one spiritual thought, not one concept. As you know, he was an Indian who grew up in India, but went to UK, became a barrister, came back to India, and then went to South Africa, where he struggled on the anti-racist movement. And then that inspiration brought him back to India and to launch the struggle for India's independence. And all of his strength came from same characteristics of fearlessness, righteousness, the search for justice, that all the scriptures. So he was a combination, although he was a devout sort of follower of Gita, but he had the knowledge of all of these religions. He had the knowledge of the East and the West. He had the knowledge of the South and the North. And right then and then, he fashioned himself, not just in his speeches, but in fact in action. And that is why he brought the notion that without religion, politics will not work, because you need the moral courage. You need the behavioral pattern that, in fact, today, as if giving speeches is enough. You tell something, but you behave differently. So Gandhi, in my view, is the meeting point, if to say. I don't know if you have read a very well-known book. You have heard of Harvard University. There is Kennedy School of Government, where everybody aspires to go and get his education. Harvard's founding dean of the Kennedy School of Government, Graham Allison, has written a book called Destined for War. And what he's talking about is that if they don't change their present trajectory, then US and China are destined for war. US and Russia are already in one way or the other, in proxy war maybe, in Ukraine, already at war. So is humanity destined for war? And of course, my own view is that war is a human creation based on our conceptualization of civis pacem para bellum, that we need to prepare, defeat, impose on other people. So he is the meeting point of many things, but most important of all, if you look at my slides, I have what we call, from all my experiences of having born and raised in the hills of Nepal without any communication facilities, having come and lived in Kathmandu and received my education there, having further studies in the US, now worked in Europe, and now back in Nepal. I feel as if I have lived in 4 different worlds. But technology has brought us into a global village. So my description of the present world is small global village of so many different worlds. And those so many different worlds are characterized by different things. But in my synthesis, there are 4 paradoxes of our time. One is called the paradox of poverty and prosperity. The world has prospered so much. There is so much wealth creation. In art, science, economics, there's so much development. And yet, do you realize that a large section of the human family lives still on unbelievable poverty and deprivation? So this is one of the biggest paradoxes of our time. While if you really want it, we have the ability to transform and share the prosperity with everybody. That's not happening. I don't have to go deeper into the wealth gap that many statistics bring. How a few individuals possess more wealth than a large section of the entire human society. So this is one of the biggest paradoxes for me. Second is, there's so much popular aspiration for peace and security. And governments are spending a lot of money on security measures. And yet, we are living in such an insecure world. Hello? Are we?
Yeah, please go ahead, sir.
We're living in an insecure world. You know that more than I do, actually, at the moment. The third is there is unprecedented development in information and communication technology that we are communicating so much right now. And yet, as I was chairing some of the most important sessions of the global community, I felt as if we are not talking to each other. We are talking across each other. You look at the social media. You know, the more influential only wants to impose his or her views, not listening to anybody else. Although the media allows you to know this. So there is this tremendous gap. The UN report says what we think is in our interest, in our own security, but we completely forget the insecurity of others. And as a result, how the response will come. So this unlimited access to information and knowledge. And yet, from all of this, in my view, such a sad commentary on human wisdom. Jnana. Because there is no will to communicate. And finally, let me make this simple quote. You've heard of, all of you have international relations students must have heard the name Professor Jeffrey Sachs. He's a professor of Columbia University. More importantly, he is the man behind what we call the Millennium Development Goals, which has now transformed into what we call the Sustainable Development. He's written a book called The Commonwealth. And writing a foreword in that book, another equally well-known professor of Harvard writes, and I'm quoting, "We, mankind, exist in a bizarre combination of Stone Age emotions, medieval beliefs and institutions, but godlike technology. This is how we have lurched into what we call the 21st century." So we live in these paradoxes. And unless we resolve these paradoxes, the crisis of global political economy, governance, security, and diplomacy is only going to continue to worsen. And Gandhi, in my view, is the meeting point of all of this. Next slide, please. So let me conclude by, Professor Sitaula, can I have the next slide? No, next one. This is already, I talked about it. So Professor Sitaula talked a lot about the Oriental, this one, Oriental wisdom. You know, the Veda is probably the foundation of modern knowledge, both social sciences and physical sciences. There's one simple sloka in the Rig Veda, the oldest of the Vedas. It is called Yatha Pinde Tatha Brahmande. So the Veda conceptualized God knows how many thousands of years ago that in fact as the microcosm, so is the macrocosm. So we live in this kind of a world. And further explaining the Veda in one of the Upanishads, describing the present world, in fact, the cosmos, in fact, the entire human creation, is a pragyanam Brahma. And what it says is the idea called Brahma is so vast. I don't know how many galaxies there are. We don't know. Now, modern science is only now discovering more and more planets. First basis of our knowledge, of our understanding, is to understand that we only understand a little. Pragyanam Brahma is so unlimited, so infinite, that in fact we don't have all the wisdom, all the information, all the knowledge. We're gradually discovering. And so, how do you translate this? And one of the main reasons for me coming to talk to the students of, I believe, the Norway University of Life Sciences. At the moment, our knowledge base is only externally acquired information. Today's academic foundation is primarily information collection. And that is part of it. That's important. We need to be informed. We need to collect externally all the information we know. We need to read books, listen to lectures, and all of that. But there's a second stage of evolution of knowledge, information to knowledge, is life experience. Whatever we learn, whatever we read, whatever we see, whatever we look at television, we need to internalize and redefine with our own life experiences. And that is what I'm doing, in the sense that having lived through so many worlds, I'm trying to now redefine some of the information and knowledge I acquired through my own life experiences. But there's one more step in my view, and that is what the sloka I recited earlier of Chanakya. Jnanam narana madhiko piseso, jnane nehina pasuvi samana. There's something unique. What Chanakya is trying to say is ahara nindra bhayamaithunani samani chaitani nirnam pasuna. What he says, ahar means eating, nindra means sleeping, waking up, going around, sort of activity. Bhaya means feeling, sense of fear and happiness and so on. And maithunani is reproduction. In those four characteristics, all species are the same. So what differentiates a human species from the rest is called jnanam narana madhiko piseso, jnane nehina pasu. So without this inner conscience of jnana, of right and wrong, human beings are the same as other animals in terms of being overwhelmed by carnal desires for consumption, dominance, power exercise. We are animalistic behaviors. So it's only by the exercise of this inner notion of however you define it, of jnana, that in fact your process of transforming information into wisdom to jnana becomes complete. So that is one of my real desires, in the sense that the world, especially we human beings, need to transform ourselves. And perhaps science and technology has given us that ability. But once and only now, humanity has that ability to transform itself. Whether we do it or not, I don't know. Are we conscious enough that we can avoid the consequences and create a new sort of world of environment? That partly depends on the future generation and students like you. When you are able to acquire as much information as possible about the world, internalize it with your own life experiences, both scientific, life sciences, but also social sciences, and then further refine it with your inner conscience. Then I think my campaign that in fact, no, wars are not humanities are not destined for wars. Humanities are not destined to destroy themselves. but it's a human creation. And as a result, we can transform ourselves. That is what makes Gandhi, to me, is so central. As Martin Luther King says, ignore at our own risk. Well, friends, I'm very happy to have this conversation with you. I've given you some reference materials, primarily first my own reflections and books. Secondly, some of the basics of international relations from the theory perspective, because all academia, partly you need to know that there are certain classic books which all students all over the world of international relations must read, must be aware of. And finally, some of the books on Gandhi. But then those are only reference materials. What you have listened to me are my own sort of constructions based on the understanding of all three aspects, and of course, my own view. Well, Professor Sitaula, thank you so much. I think we are more or less
Thank you so
on
much,
time.
Dr. Simkhada. There are some questions from a student here. The student now, I think, thank you so much, Professor Simkhada, for your generous and time with us, and I thank you everybody for being here.